Hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 of an Introduction to Public Financial Disclosure. I'm Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. In part 1 of this series, we discussed the goals and purposes of public financial disclosure. And one of the most critical roles that public financial disclosure plays is in helping us to identify, to prevent, and to certainly remediate any potential or actual conflicts of interest or other ethics concerns before they have a chance to harm the programs, operations, and reputations of our agencies. And in order to do that, we really have to have a well-trained staff to conduct robust reviews and certifications of the reports that we receive. And in order to do that, today we want to spend a lot of time talking about your roles and responsibilities as reviewers and certifiers to show you how you can use the tools that you have at your disposal in your agencies and that OGE has provided to make sure you can play whatever part you have in this process to the best of your ability. So we're going to start with who certifies, who has the authority to certify, who can act in the role of certifier. And the fact of the matter is, of course, the designated agency ethics official and the alternate have the authority to certify public financial disclosure reports. But they can also, the designated agency ethics official can also delegate that authority for virtually all public financial disclosure reports to other people, deputy ethics officials, deputy ethics counselors, or anyone who holds a similar or equivalent position. The only exception to that is in the case of nominees to presidentially appointed Senate confirmed positions. And in that circumstance, either the DAO must certify or the alternate DAO may do so in the DAO's absence. So a variety of people within your program can have the authority to be a certifier. So who can review? Now, there are various levels of review that can occur, and whether or not an agency has someone other than the certifier conduct an intermediate review, I think varies depending upon the staff levels you have and certainly the volume of public financial disclosures that you have to review. But there are two types of intermediate reviews that we address explicitly in our Public Financial Disclosure Reviewer's Guide. One are full intermediate reviews. Now, these are intermediate level reviews which are the functional equivalent of a certifying review, which is to say that they meet all of the standards that are required of certification. So people who are conducting a full intermediate review are doing both a technical review of the form to make sure that it meets all of the reporting requirements. They're doing a substantive review of the form to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest or other ethics concerns raised by anything that the filer has disclosed. And then these people in doing the full intermediate review also have the ability to apply remedies to any potential or actual ethics issues that they find. So if you have someone on staff who is going to be conducting a full intermediate review in support of the certification, they have to have the training and ability to perform a full-fledged review to the certification requirements. Now, there are some agencies, particularly I think those that have an enormous number of public financial disclosure reports to review, who may triage the review of reports and provide certain individuals with responsibilities for only conducting a very limited intermediate review. And this might involve simply reviewing the report to make sure that all of the parts have been filled out correctly, or if there is nothing to report, that has been noted as well. It could be more extensive where that individual will do a review to make sure that it appears as though all of the parts are not only filled out, but that they do appear to be materially complete. Whether that review is limited to simply making certain that all of the parts are, the boxes are checked, or something a little bit more substantial, those individuals also have to have the training to be able to adequately discern those things. So whether it's a limited review or a more substantial intermediate review, it is really imperative that anyone who's playing any of those roles is doing it robustly, because it's all with a view to supporting the certification, the eventual certification of those reports. So what does certification mean? What are we certifying to? So to certify the report, the reviewer has to determine to their satisfaction that each required part of the report has been completed, is materially complete, and also that there is no interest or position that violates or appears to violate applicable law or regulation. And those applicable law or regulation include Title 18 of the United States Code, the Criminal Conflict of Interest statutes. It includes the Ethics in Government Act. It includes the Standards of Ethical Conduct, as well as your own agency's regulations. So in conducting these reviews, whether they're intermediate or final, and then final certification, which involves making sure that it's technically complete, making sure that it complies with applicable law regulation, which also involves remediating any potential or actual conflicts or other ethics concerns that we find, what is the time frame in which we are expected to do that? And if you look at this is in section 4 of the Public Financial Disclosure Reviewer's Guide, the predicate is basically 60 days. The initial review specifically has to be conducted within 60 days of receiving the report. If you don't require any additional information, or you don't disclose, there's nothing that disclosed that seems to require a remedy, then it is expected that you will certify that report before the 60-day period expires. Now, if you have a situation where you've undertaken the review within 60 days, but you're having to get additional information, or you're finding that there are some potential conflicts or other ethics concerns that need remediation, then you can potentially you can extend that beyond the 60-day requirement. But I think the good benchmark for you to consider is that anytime you're going to have to exceed the 60 days, because the 60 days really is the predicate, you really need to document. You need to have evidence that there's a reason why you weren't able to conduct a complete review and certification within 60 days. Now, we're going to be talking about the technical review in some degree of detail later on in this session. So I wanted to start with the substantive review and talk about what the expectations are and the roles are of anyone who's going to conduct a substantive review of the public financial disclosure reports. Now, as we mentioned before, in order to certify that the employee is in compliance with applicable law and regulation, as the substantive reviewer, you are going to have familiarity with the criminal statutes 18 U.S.C. sections 201 through 209, with the standards of conduct, which are at 5 CFR Part 2635, and obviously with any of your own agency-specific regulations, supplemental regulations, or perhaps prohibited holdings restrictions, if any. And with the view that the review goals are, we want to prevent ethics issues, conflicts where possible, and we certainly want to fix them when we find them. It's important to know that one of the primary authorities that you're going to be doing, using as a basis for your substantive review is 18 U.S.C. Section 208. And that is because that's the statute that explicitly addresses financial conflicts of interest. So how do we identify conflicts, a 208 type of conflict? And we really need two pieces of information in order to do that. We need to know the duties of the position of the employee. We need to know, generally speaking, what types of programs and operations are they going to be working on. Because we're going to have to ask ourselves, is it possible that the employee's participation in certain kinds of agency work would involve or affect any of the interests that they've disclosed on their public financial disclosure report? Similarly, when we're looking at the interests, when we're looking at what they've actually disclosed on the form, we should be looking at it through the lens and asking the question, could any of these interests that I'm seeing disclosed here on this form be affected by agency programs And are those then agency programs that this filer is likely to be participating in? And then, of course, if you have any prohibited holdings restrictions for your agency, you're going to want to make sure that nothing that's disclosed on the form would appear to fall within the ambit of those prohibited holdings restrictions. Now, to aid and abet your substantive review, there are some agency resources that you really should have on hand. You're going to have a description or at least some basic knowledge of the filer's duties. And that may very well be just some general idea of the program area in which they are positioned and what the nature of those types of programs and operations are that the filer would likely be participating in. If you're dealing with an annual report, you're going to want to look at the filer's prior reports and any reviewer notes that might be there to aid you in whatever it is that you're looking at in the current filing year. Of course, you're going to want to have access to and an understanding of your agency supplemental regulations or any prohibited holdings restrictions. And there are some agencies that have contractor or grantee or otherwise a prohibited source list, which it can also be helpful in allowing you to sort of immediately flag things you see on the report that you think might involve a prohibited source for your organization. For purposes of conflicts of interest, as we talked about in Part 2 under the Tools section, OGE has a series of guides that are analyses of various potential conflicts of interest for different types of assets and employment and income sources. So you will want to avail yourself of this particular resource when you're doing your own conflicts analysis. But in addition to 18 U.S.C. Section 208, there are other common ethics issues that you're also going to be asked to issue spot and to resolve if you find them. There are potential impartiality and misuse of position types of issues, use of public office for private gain types of issues that can arise with respect to the filer's current outside employment or former non-federal employment. Certainly the spouse's non-federal employer and any employment interests that the spouse has can raise issues of impartiality or misuse of position. And any business interests, partnerships, or other types of affiliations of that nature that the filer might have. In addition, if your filer indicates that they are involved in outside positions or outside activities, if you have a prior approval process, that's certainly going to be something you're going to want to make sure that they have materially complied with. But even if you don't have a prior approval requirement, you're going to want to make sure that anything that they're engaged in that is along the lines of teaching, speaking, or writing is in conformity with 2635.807, that you counsel them on their use of title, position, and information, and that we want to make sure that they're not engaging in any representational services or advocacy which could implicate other criminal conflict of interest concerns. We also have to have at the ready an understanding and a willingness to implement a full array of remedies for when we do find a potential or an actual conflict of interest or other ethics concern. So when it comes to something where the duties could implicate some of the financial holdings that the employee has, we want to be able to meaningfully discuss with the employee the possibility of recusal, which is to say that the employee would have to disqualify themselves from participating in certain kinds of matters, either completely or unless or until another remedy is applied. With respect to interests that you see, remedies that can apply to certain interests that you see on the form, there are exemptions from the criminal conflict of interest statutes, which are located in Part 2640 of 5 CFR. You should become familiar with those exemptions because exemptions do apply automatically. Divestiture is also a remedy for particular types of holdings that are amenable to divestiture, so you want to be aware of that as a remedy for any potential conflict that you might uncover. And certainly resignation is a remedy for outside positions that might present material conflicts with the employee's duties. Now, to assist you in training yourself up on substantive review, we have included a playlist with the materials that are included with all of these videos on the IEG website, which are resources for you to conduct sort of a self-study or a self-directed professional development to assist you in conducting the substantive legal review of a 278E. And of course, the Institute for Ethics in Government has a resource library that has even more resources in addition to what's on that playlist that can assist you with both the substantive and technical aspects of conducting a public financial disclosure review. So your technical review is going to be with a view to making sure that the filer is materially complying with the disclosure requirements of 5 CFR Part 2634, which are the financial disclosure regulations. And Section 2 of the guide deals explicitly with the different parts of the Form 278E. And the guide are basically a comprehensive set of instructions, both for the filer on how to file and for you as the reviewer to know what it is that they should be reporting, but even more so for you to be able to have a better understanding of the nature of the things that people will be disclosing, because that is going to aid and abet your substantive review. So these are all written in the form of instructions, and these instructions are indeed for everyone because they will serve your function as well as serving the function of assisting employees and filers in filling out their forms. So the Public Financial Disclosure Guide has a section which is directed to and for filers, which is demarcated here on the left-hand side of the screen. For you, the tab exists at the bottom for ethics officials, and when you open that up, you're going to see that those reside next to one another, and particularly for purposes of the review of the 278E and the 278T, it is important to have those parallel sets of instructions up there, because while you might think they, on first blush, appear redundant of one another, they actually are not. They are quite complementary. The information that's available there for ethics officials is not redundant of what's there for employees, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a minute. So this is Section 2. This is dealing with the 278E. And we're going to start by talking sort of generally about how to approach the information that's on the report in a way that can make it comprehensible and so that you know what to expect when you're asked to review a report. And I think one of the things that you need to be thinking about is how each of the parts are structured. While generally speaking, information that's required to be reported is for that of the filer as well as the spouse and dependent children, it's important to know that sections 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're only going to see information for the filer. When you're looking at those sections, you're going to be looking at information that applies only to the filer. So that's any filer's outside positions, any employment assets and income that they have, any employment agreements and arrangements that they have, and any sources of non-governmental compensation. That's all for the filer. Once you get into sections 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, you're going to start seeing information that may also include information about the spouse and dependent children. Section 5 is for the spouse only. That's spouse's employment, assets, and income. Section 6, other assets and income. That's going to be filer, spouse, or dependent children. Same thing with 7 for transactions, 8 for liabilities, and 9 for gifts and travel reimbursements. Those all could have information that pertains to both the filer, the spouse, and any dependent children. In the section that discusses spouses and dependent children, it outlines exactly what I just said to you here, that these are the parts of the form where you can expect to see or potentially expect to see information about the spouses and dependent children. This section is also going to provide you with definitions for what's a spouse, what is a dependent child as opposed to a minor child, when does a dependent child cease to be a dependent child, and when and under what circumstances does the sort of marital dissolution results that you no longer have to report, and a filer doesn't have to report the spouse's holdings any longer. Now I want you to, we're going to be talking a little bit how the guide is structured with respect to the type of information that is supplied for you, the ethics official, under the ethics official tab, and I'm going to call that the ethics official view, as opposed to the information that's being provided for each part of the form under the filer's view. So the structure of the guide is this. As I said before, the ethics official's instructions, which I have here on the right-hand side, basically are written directions. When you look at any part of the form under the guide, you're going to see the same thing under the ethics official instructions. You're going to see written directions that address what to report, how to report, what is not reportable, whether there's nothing to report, how do you do that, and then some of them contain notes that are specifically for reviewers only. Under the filer's instructions, which you're also going to want to consult when you're doing your reviews, and also if filers have questions. Parts 1, 4, 7, 8, and 9 are structured accordingly. They have tables with illustrative examples of correct reporting, and then they also have a link to a frequently asked questions separate page that comes up in connection with the types of information that's required to be reported on those parts. Parts 2, 3, 5, and 6 look different when you pull them up. Rather than immediately seeing a table with illustrative examples and immediately seeing a link to frequently asked questions, what you're going to see is basically a list, an index of assets and sources of income with links to pages that have the more expansive instruction and frequently asked questions. And I'm going to show you this so that you understand what I'm saying and why it's important. So here we are on part 1 of the 278E, which requires filers to list the positions that they held outside of the United States government. As you can see here, as I said before, these are the filing instructions that you're going to have, the written directions you're going to have. Here are what to report, how to report, what's not reportable, nothing to report, and if there are any notes for reviewers. What I also want you to note, and you're going to see this peppered throughout the guide, and it's really important to take note of it and take advantage of it. You're going to see highlighted hyperlinks that if you click on them are going to take you to a separate window and provide you with a specific description of the thing that has been highlighted. So here we have, for example, reporting period. As you may or may not be aware, each part of the form has a different reporting period, and that can vary depending upon the kind of report that it is. So we've got a lot of moving parts here. So here you're going to want to tag this reporting period for part 1, and if you do, it'll take you to a separate screen that tells you precisely what the reporting periods for part 1 are for each of the types of reports that you might ostensibly be reviewing. Now, likewise, I had highlighted another term that was on that page, which is for political entities, that if you hold a position with a political entity, that's not something that needs to be reported. When you click on that hyperlink, it brings you up to a page which explains to you, okay, what constitutes a political entity for purposes of this filing requirement. So now that was for the ethics official view. Now if we go over to part 1, the filer's view, you'll see what I was referring to before, which is here we have a table that has illustrative examples of how the employee actually what it should look like if the filer is reporting things correctly. And in addition to that, if you go to the bottom of that page, you'll see there's a hyperlink to frequently asked questions document, which if you click on that, will take you to a separate window where you can see there are actual questions that deal with common questions that employees have and that reflect some policy decisions, obviously, that OGE has already made about some of these common events. So for example, I'm on the board of directors of my homeowners association. That's a common question. What's the answer to that question? I'm a member of an advisory board committee. Is that something that would have to be reported as an outside position? And the answer is provided. So these have as much to do with your review of the form and your becoming familiar with what is or isn't required to be reported on the form as it is an assistance to the filer. Same thing with Part 4, structured the same way. You have Part 4, the filer's sources of compensation exceeding $5,000 in a year. Now what I wanted to, you're going to see the same things here, what to report, how to report, what isn't reportable. What I want to highlight from this page is note that we indicate right up in the title who has to fill this part out so that you know immediately, okay, this isn't anything for an annual filer. So Part 4 doesn't have to be filled out by an annual filer or termination filer. And on the filer's view, it's similar to what we said before. They also get the notification that unless you're a nominee or a new entrant, you don't have to fill this out. But if you are, table with illustrative examples, some frequently asked questions document. And these are the frequently asked questions for Part 4. For Part 7, transactions, the structure is the same. What I want to highlight here for you is because there are transaction requirements for annual and termination reports, which are distinguishable from the transaction requirements of the periodic transaction reports or the OGE Form 278Ts, it's important that you can see that even within discussions of transactions for purposes of annual and termination reports, we also have directions for reviewers about what the relationship is between these types of transactions and the transactions that occur in a periodic transaction report. Now, in Section 3 of the guide, it does discuss explicitly the requirements that for the OGE Form 278T, but I think it's interesting to note, and it's important for you to know, that those differences, distinctions are discussed within the instructions for transactions for annual and termination reports as well. Similarly, when you go to the filer's view and you pull up the frequently asked questions, the first two questions effectively discuss the distinction between the periodic transaction report or the relationship between the periodic transaction report and the annual and termination reports. So I reported a purchase on my PTR. Do I have to report the transaction again in my annual report? Are the transaction reporting requirements for annual or termination the same as for my periodic transaction report? So if you yourself aren't sufficiently comfortable with the distinctions, this frequently asked question document can help you inform your own understanding of those distinctions. And as I said before, there's a separate frequently asked questions document for specifically addressing the Form 278T. For Part 8, liabilities, this is the same for in the ethics official's view as for other parts. What I want to highlight for you under the filer's view, I mean, obviously we have the table with illustrative examples, but what we also have here are a whole series of highlighted, linked, common types of reportable liabilities that you can click on, and you'll be given a separate page with some discussion of these discrete types of reportable liabilities. So boat loans, capital commitments, credit card debt, exercise lines of credit, margin accounts. So again, there's a lot more information here than like meets the eye at first glance. Take full advantage of all of these hyperlinks that have all of this wonderful information that can help you know not only what has to be disclosed, but will help you understand what the nature of those things are that are being required to be disclosed. And again, there are frequently asked questions document for Part 8. Part 9 is similar. This is for gifts and travel reimbursements. Again, it indicates it's only for annual termination filers. They have, because the filing requirements for gifts and travel reimbursements has two different and interrelated dollar thresholds that have to be calculated in order to determine if something is reportable. I've highlighted here that we do offer some concrete, examples to demonstrate sort of the math that's involved in reporting for gifts and travel reimbursements. So that's the piece I wanted to highlight for you here on the ethics official view. And then of course under the filer's view, it's what we've said before, which is the table with some demonstrated examples of how to report, and then a frequently asked questions document with respect to gifts and travel reimbursements. So now with Part 2, as with Part 3, Part 5, and Part 6, we're going to see a different set of screens, particularly when we get into the filer's view. This is the filer's employment assets and income and retirement accounts is on Part 2 of the 278E. So here we're trying to discover the variety of ways that a filer's outside employment could provide or have provided certain types of employment-related assets and income, which are distinguishable from general assets and income. So if you look on the filer's view, this is what I was telling you. On the filer's view, what you're going to see is a list, and it is a rather extensive list of types of assets and sources of income that are employment-related assets and income. Now, I've just chosen one here for purposes of illustration, and so I've pulled up deferred compensation. So when you click on that, then what it's going to do is it's going to bring you up to a new page with a much more comprehensive discussion of what constitutes deferred compensation. And as you'll see in these boxes, not only do you get a description of sort of like what deferred compensation is generally, but there are 5 extensive examples, distinct examples of things that constitute deferred compensation. And then when you get to the end of the 5th example in this filer's view, you'll also find a frequently asked questions document that's related to specifically deferred compensation. Part 3 is structured the same, and this is for filers, employment agreements, and arrangements. So what are we talking about here? Okay, so here we're talking about things like agreements or arrangements for future employment, for a leave of absence, for continuing payments from a prior employer, for continuing participation in an employee benefit plan. That sort of type of interest is what one would expect to see on this form. And so similarly, when you go to the filer's view, you're going to be seeing precisely a litany of those kinds of employment agreements or arrangements that one could reasonably expect to be reportable on a 278E. Part 5, this is for the spouse. So here we have the spouse's employment assets and income and retirement accounts, which is kind of like the equivalent of the filer's Part 2. So here the employee's spouse is going to be listing any of the employment-related assets and income and retirement accounts that they have. Again, we have the very long list of those types of related assets and income. Part 6 is other assets and income. Now, this is distinguishable from the employment-related ones. So you can imagine that the list that we're about to see on the filer's view is going to be rather extraordinary. And it is. And we see there is some sort of exotica here, things that we wouldn't typically expect to see or wouldn't necessarily know much about, American depository receipts and the like. This, again, is a beautiful resource for you to familiarize yourself with the kinds of things that you might expect to see on a form before you actually see them on a form. So if you want to use these indices as a way to get yourself up to speed on the kinds of things that you might reasonably expect to see on the form, again, before you're set to the task of actually reviewing, it might be worth your while to do. I have chosen a rather pedestrian example to show you what that looks like when you click on it and pull it up. I chose exchange traded funds. And as you can see on here, there are frequently asked questions that are associated with that you could click on that would then go to another page that would talk specifically about exchange traded funds. But we also have a hyperlink to the word exchange traded funds. So if you click on that, it'll take you to a page that will explain to you what an exchange traded fund is. Now again, it's important to know for your purposes how the employees should be reporting this to make sure that they're materially compliant. But more importantly, you really have to become familiar with the nature of these types of holdings. And that's where this information becomes really important for your substantive review, because the more you understand operationally what these things are and how they need to be reported, it's going to help inform your understanding about the extent to which these types of holdings could present a potential conflict of interest or other ethics concern for your employee. Now, there are a few additional aspects in Section 4 that are kind of directly related to your review and certification of the report. The first one is where to obtain or when to obtain additional information. Now, this has your sort of general standard of scrutiny, like when do you have enough and when do you need more? Well, in order to know that, you need to know what the standard of scrutiny is and what you have to have materially established constitutes completeness of the report. But I think there's the piece that I want to alert you to under that section are these additional considerations. Because what OG has tried to do for you here is to point out specifically some policy decisions that we've made about things you should do that maybe some flexibilities that you can exercise when you're engaging in your review of your forms, particularly your technical review. So for example, we say for purposes of all OG Form 278E reports, agencies are not expected to be rigid in distinguishing employment assets and income from other assets and income. So Parts 2 and Parts 5, which are supposed to be employment-related assets and income, we're saying that in many circumstances you can have flexibility if some of those things get reported under other assets and income rather than under employment assets and income. So that's a nice thing to know, that's a flexibility you have. Under new entrant and nominee reports, we're giving you a perspective on how you should approach a new entrant or nominee report, which is to say that it's a story of the person's finances. So you should look for obvious gaps in that story, such as long-term employment with no retirement plan, or a new entrant with significant stock holdings and no employment. So if what you're seeing on the form doesn't seem to make sense because it doesn't seem to read like a story and there seem to be missing parts, that's sort of philosophically a way to approach, or methodologically a way to approach a report that can help you sort of figure out when and under what circumstance you should be concerned about what you're seeing or not seeing on a filer's report. Similarly, on annual reports, we say explicitly, you're not required to perform a line-by-line comparison between the filer's current annual report and the filer's most recent prior report. What we're looking for are apparent inconsistencies or some significant changes. Similarly, under termination reports, we say the same thing about termination reports as we did with annuals, but additionally we say, you know, it's a termination report. This person is leaving government service. You know, getting in contact with them because of something that you think is missing is probably not going to be easy, so it may not be reasonable to seek additional information with respect to just reporting issues if they're not issues that would affect the conflict of interest analysis. And we also talk about over-reporting. So these are just, I think, additional points of guidance for you that you may want to take a good look at, particularly if you're brand new to review and certification. We also talk about amending reports and annotating reports. You are going to have circumstances where you know, either the filer is going to have to make those changes or you're going to have to initiate those changes. What this section talks about is how do you do that when you haven't done final certification yet, so what are the requirements to do it for that? How do you do it after you've done the final certification at the agency level? And then for those that you send to OGE, how do you engage in report amendments and annotations after OGE has certified the report? And finally, we talk in this section about supporting notes. Now, supporting notes are all those reviewer notes that you may have taken in the course of doing your review that you're going to want to keep for the benefit of the next person who comes down the line who has to review the next report. And this discusses how you keep them, where you keep them, whether and to what extent they are part of the report, whether and to what extent any of them are publicly available. So the supporting notes section is another section where you may want to be mindful of how you should be treating any of the reviewer notes that you are taking while you are in the conduct of your review. So to recap, the goals of our review and certification are to prevent ethics issues, to prevent conflicts and potential conflicts where possible, and to fix any problems we find when we find them. To do that, you have to engage in a very thorough and robust technical review to make sure the employee is materially complying with the regulatory requirements, the statutory requirements of disclosure. But we also need to do a robust substantive review in order to be able to determine whether anything we're seeing on the form presents a conflict or a potential conflict with the employee's duties. Certification is doing just that. You have to determine to your satisfaction that each required part of the form is complete and that no interest or position disclosed violates or appears to violate applicable law or regulation. We all have different roles to play in this process. I hope that this series has helped you understand better what that role is and that we've provided you with the tools to make sure that you can play your part to the best of your ability. Thank you.